Well, let's dive in, shall we? The first lesson in your handout is called Introduction to the Gospels, Authors and Dates. Now, I will be the first to tell you that this is one of the most boring lessons of the week. So if you can get through this one, you'll be on your way, okay? Now, what do I mean by that? I'll just play my hand up front. I believe Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, okay? Matthew is one of the 12 disciples that Jesus called to follow him. You know him as Levi, of course. He was the tax collector. And Mark was Peter's companion, right? And Luke was one of Paul's companions, okay? Now, the reason, nonetheless, I want to take the time to discuss this is because there are some in our world who argue that Matthew did not write Matthew, Luke did not write Luke, and Mark did not write Mark. Who wrote these books? Well, we don't know. Some Christians after, that says after 70 AD. Why do you think contemporary scholars, not all, I'm just saying some, think that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written after 70 AD? Anybody know? Why is that a critical date for discerning the date and authorship of these books?
It seems like the temple.
Yes.
It's like Luke 24, right?
Yes, right. This is the year the temple was destroyed, right? Right? So the Roman general Titus destroyed the temple in 70 AD, and in places like Matthew 24 and Mark 13 and Luke 21, Jesus is predicting the destruction of the temple. Now, this is a massive event. I mean, it is impossible to wrap your head around how big the temple was, how central the temple was, and how indestructible the temple was. Right? That temple would be torn down to the ground was just completely unimaginable. And there Jesus is predicting that it will be done. And then it's done. It happens. And so liberal scholars say, well, clearly Matthew, Mark, and Luke are written after 70 AD, and Jesus never said those things. Right? Those words are put in Jesus' mouth by a later generation in order to make Jesus look like a prophet. So in Matthew 22, verse 7, he says, the king was angry, and he sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Clearly, this is a reflection on 70 AD, after 70 AD, and the words are put into Jesus' mouth. That's number one. Number two. Scholars note that there seems to be a lot of conflict with the Pharisees. I think this is obvious to see. We don't need to turn to any passages for proof of that. The Pharisees are Jesus' primary antagonist in the Gospels. And we know that after 70 AD, Christians were kicked out of synagogues. Christians are kicked out of synagogues, and we know that really began to happen around the 80s and 90s. And so clearly what's happening in the book of, let's say, Matthew, Jesus never really had that many run-ins with the Pharisees. Jesus himself might have been viewed by some as a Pharisee. The Pharisees were not really bad guys. According to the people of the land, they liked the Pharisees. They liked them more than the Sadducees, because at least the Pharisees would come to their town and teach them. Okay? But in the Gospels, they seem really harsh. And Jesus has a lot of conflict with them. And so what scholars say is that there's a conflict in the synagogues with the Christians and the Pharisees after the destruction of the temple, and that tension has been put back into the Gospel of Matthew. Again, after 70 AD, a later community retrofitting the historical Jesus with their contemporary problem. Now, if I ever say something that doesn't make sense, you got to raise your hand, okay? Don't be ashamed. Don't be afraid. I want to hear. I want to know what you're thinking. I want to know that you're keeping up. Okay? So that's number 2. Number 3, Jesus uses the word ecclesia, which means what? Church. 2 times. 16:18 and 18:17. 16:18 and 18:17, Jesus uses the word church. But the church, as we know it, a collection of Christians who have been what? Kicked out of the synagogue, doesn't emerge until later generations. How in the world would Jesus at that time have been talking about a community of believers gathering together in a regular time interval? You know what I mean? And even if he did, how would his people to whom he's talking even know what he means? Right? Finally, number 4, there seemed to be, I'm going to leave it there. That's going to be enough. So for these reasons, a lot of people believe that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are not written by Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but written by somebody or communities much later and putting words back into Jesus' mouth and recreating scenarios in Jesus' life to suit their contemporary problem, 50 years after Jesus is long gone. 50 years after Jesus is long gone. One contemporary popular name is Bart Ehrman. Have you heard that name before? Yeah? Okay, so Bart Ehrman, he's not alone in this. He argues that, once Jesus was crucified and their stories started to circulate about his resurrection, people told stories about Jesus. But as people traveled from one town to another and told these stories about Jesus, those stories changed. Maybe Jesus did something generous one day and he was able to feed 5 people with some food his disciples were carrying. Well, that's really not too impressive of a story. So in the next town, someone changed that story from 5 people to what? 50 people. And 50 people becomes 500 people. 500 people becomes 5,000 people. And then someone says, oh, you know what? That makes him look like Moses. So let's dress this story up as much as possible to make it look like Israel in the wilderness and Jesus is feeding a great multitude just like Moses did. You follow me? There's this evolutionary dynamic whereby what really happened in Jesus' life, we don't know, but it evolved over time to give us what we have today, some 40 to 50 years after the life of Jesus. What I want to do, it looks like after the coffee break then, is I want to take just a few moments, because I don't want to press too far into it, in time-wise, take a few moments to make the case that Matthew wrote Matthew before 70 AD. And the reason I picked Matthew is because Matthew's the hardest one to prove. Mark and Luke are easier to prove, so I'm going to take the hardest one. We're going to focus on Matthew, and if we can show that Matthew was written before 70 AD and written by the Apostle Matthew, then we'll be way down the road with Mark and Luke. Does that sound good? So on your handout there, I have this quote from Irenaeus. It's a pretty lengthy quote. Anybody want to read that for us? Very good. Thank you very much. So Irenaeus' dates, 2nd century? Anybody know? 2nd century? Yep, I think that's right. So there's a very early testimony of the early Christians' understanding of where did these Gospels come from. What observations stand out to you from this passage? Give me a couple things that, as Isaiah was reading, you mentally took note of. All right, what do you think? Somebody represent your group and tell me what stood out to you in this reading. Somebody over here, maybe. Gemetchus. And Matthew wrote first? Is that what you said?
No, Matthew wrote while Peter and Paul were still alive.
Okay. Oh, good. So that means before 64 or 66 AD. So good. So Peter and Paul probably died somewhere in 64 to 66. So that would mean Matthew must have written before 60, at least before 66. Right? Okay, good. Excellent. Yep. Yeah, good. So Irenaeus, being an early church father, recognizes that the key issue here is apostolic authorship, right? Now, notice, this is really important, so I'm glad you pointed that out. What is an apostle? An apostle is someone who is an eyewitness of Jesus' life from the beginning all the way through to the resurrection and handpicked by Jesus to execute his will, right? So there were other people who followed Jesus right from the beginning. They were witnesses all the way through, but they weren't necessarily apostles because Jesus did not single them out as executors of his will. Does that make sense? Paul later can be added to the apostleship because Jesus appears to him. Jesus can pick an apostle any way he wants, right? But you'll remember in the beginning of the book of Acts when Judas is gone, if you're familiar with this or not, but at the beginning, they want to replace Judas and says, he must have been with us from the beginning, from the baptism of John until the day when he was taken up. One of these men must be witnesses of his resurrection. All right, so the apostles understood themselves as those who were with Jesus from the beginning, handpicked by Jesus all the way through to the resurrection, right? And if Paul can be added to the apostleship later by the will of Jesus, that's Jesus' will. He can do whatever he wants, right? But Irenaeus here would understand that Matthew, therefore, is an apostle, right? Now, were Mark and Luke apostles? Matthew, yes, he was with Jesus from the beginning. Was Mark an apostle? No, he wasn't. So how do we understand his apostolic authority? Because he's associated with Peter, right? He wrote down Peter's testimony of Jesus, who was clearly an apostle, right? Matthew, Mark, and Luke, of course, same thing. Luke is not an apostle, but he's associated with Paul, the one handpicked by the resurrected Lord to be an apostle. The reason this is critical here is because and then the last one is who? This is, of course, John, and John was with Jesus from the beginning and witness of his resurrection. The reason this is important is because how many Gospels does that make? 4. And how many Gospels do you have in your Bible? 4. Really convenient, right? What that means is the church has preserved from the days of Irenaeus those very same books that you have in front of you, right? Because they are what? Eyewitness testimony. Where does it say that? It doesn't matter, I don't see it right now, but we'll come back to it. We have the witness of people who are with Jesus and therefore can testify to the truthfulness of what they saw, right? And, Irenaeus adds, they were given the gift of the Spirit. We know from John 14, 15, 16 that Jesus promises the Spirit will come uniquely to the apostles to bear that kind of authority and have, as Irenaeus says here, perfect knowledge. He will lead you into the knowledge of all things, Jesus tells them, right? So what we have here is a very, systematic theological understanding of something, of the origins of the Gospels, not written by, Wayne Grudem or whoever else is on your shelf, rather given to us by someone from the 2nd century, or an early church father. So we're with this difficult question. Do we take the presumed works of liberal scholars in the 19th and 20th century as to the origins of the knowledge of the destruction of the temple, or whether the Pharisees or the ecclesia necessitate a post-70 AD date or a pre-66 date because that's as long as the apostles lived, when that testimony is given to us by a 2nd century representative in Irenaeus. Second second sort of observation I would make right now is the idea of Matthean priority. Okay, so let's go back to the date of when Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written. So since the I think it was late 1800s and into the 1900s, there was a question that scholars were asking called the Synoptic problem. The Synoptic problem. The Synoptic problem is a question as to who wrote first. I don't know why they called it a problem. It should be called the Synoptic question. But when you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's clear that there's some borrowing between the books. Somebody had their hand on the other books and copied some material. Something like 80% of Mark is also in Matthew, right? So how do we understand that? Well, the best way to understand it is somebody wrote first and the other apostles saw what they wrote and used some of what they wrote. Simple as that, right? For the longest time, there was a hypothesis, and still the reigning hypothesis today, called Markan priority. Markan priority is the idea that Mark wrote first, and Matthew and Luke borrowed from Mark. Now, where does this hypothesis come from? Well, Mark is said to be more primitive. Mark is shorter. And so as we look at Matthew and Luke, it seems they got their hands on Mark and expanded upon Mark to say more about Jesus' life. Now, if Markan priority is true, and Mark itself is written after 70 AD, right? Then Matthew and Luke are even later, 80 and 90 AD. Does that make sense? But the early church did not recognize Markan priority. The early church fathers, all of them, recognized that Matthew wrote first. They all claim that Matthew wrote first. There's no debate at all about it, right? So again, we've got the testimony of liberal post-Enlightenment scholars versus the earlier 2nd and 3rd century church fathers. The next thing I want to point out is, was the temple really destroyed at the time of writing? Let's go back to that. Remember the line that we read from Matthew 22? The king was angry and he sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Clearly, that's a retrospective look at the destruction of 70 AD. But is it really? Is it really? That same language is used in Jeremiah 21:10, 32:29, and 34:2. Jeremiah 21:10, 32:29, and 34:2. In other words, that could very well have been the language of Jesus in the time before the destruction of the temple, where he's simply doing what he does a lot of elsewhere, borrowing the language of the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and then reusing them in his own time. Moreover, there were others who had predicted the destruction of the temple. You've probably heard of the Qumran community or the Qumran Covenanters. We're going to say more about them in a little bit. But they were a group of Jews living in the desert in Jesus' time. They too predicted the destruction of the temple. And we know that they wrote before 70 AD. We know that because after the Romans destroyed the temple, they went over to the Qumran compound and destroyed that. You understand? So all of their texts must have been written before 70 AD. So there are others, not just Jesus, predicting the destruction of the temple. So it's not so outrageous to think that this Galilean rabbi called Jesus of Nazareth would have thought the temple is cursed and that the temple is going to be destroyed by God, because there were others as well who said similar things. Moreover, if you go back to Matthew 5, Jesus says, if you are offering your gift at the altar and remember that your brethren has something against you, leave your gift before the altar and go and reconcile it to your brother, then bring your gift. Now, if the temple is already destroyed and some later community is retrofitting words into Jesus' mouth, why would they include that? Do you understand my question? There is no altar anymore. So they've got this Jesus talking about giving your gift at the altar of the temple, but there is no temple anymore. Does that make sense? Also, take a look at 17:24. Matthew 17:24. When they came to Capernaum, the collectors of the half-shekel tax went up to Peter and said, "Does your teacher pay the tax?" Again, if this is a community after 70 AD, writing this story and creating it in order to fit their context, why would they put a concern for the temple tax back into Jesus' mouth and Peter's interaction with the people of Capernaum? It just doesn't make sense. And then 23, 26, well, that's enough for now. The point is, while it looks like there may be things from after the temple's destruction being put back into Jesus' mouth. There are other ways to explain it. One, he's simply using stock and trade prophetic language borrowed from Jeremiah. Plus, there are other passages in Matthew that demonstrate that there is a concern for matters of the temple, putting your gift before the altar, paying the temple tax, which presuppose what? The temple is still standing when that book is written. So, we have Irenaeus and others affirming apostolic authorship and Matthean priority. We have the idea of the temple being destroyed being quite common, actually, in Jesus' day. I would also add that there's no dependence on Paul. Now, why is that critical? There's no dependence on Paul. In other words, when you read Matthew, it doesn't seem that Matthew has any Pauline theology. Well, he does. He doesn't have any Paul's language. He just doesn't explain things the same way Paul does. Why do you think that's important? Why would it be important to observe that Matthew doesn't use Pauline themes or language? Yeah. And Paul was very influential. Paul wrote letters all over the Greco-Roman world. People knew his name. Even before he got to Galatia, people said, isn't that the guy who used to throw us in jail? Right? So Paul is very well known, and Paul is very influential. And so if you're going to write anything in those later eras, like in the 80s or 90s, in order to gain some authority for your writing, you would incorporate some of the theology that's already known to be verifiable. That is to say, Paul's theology. But there isn't anything like that. Again, attesting to an earlier date. And so I conclude that Matthew was written before 70 AD. Now, here's my last point. Maybe this isn't as convincing to me, but maybe it is to you. It is to other people. One of Matthew's favorite words or phrases is, "Thus was fulfilled what was said by the prophet," right? And so you would think that if this is written after 70 AD, the author or authors, whoever they may be, would have had a hard time resisting concluding at the destruction of the temple, "Thus fulfilled what was said by Jesus." Do you understand? If they wrote after 70 AD, he would have pointed out, look, and that was fulfilled as Jesus had said, like he likes to say elsewhere in the book. And he doesn't say that. Again, testifying to the sense that this book was written before 70 AD. Well, if it's written before 70 AD, who wrote it? Who wrote it? And I'm going to argue that an eyewitness wrote it. But Bauckham wrote a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. What? You have that copy? Yeah. Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. And his argument goes like this. Let's do this. Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. Everybody recognizes that the Gospels were written outside of the land. They were not written in Jerusalem. So Mark wrote in Antioch. Matthew wrote in Antioch. Mark wrote either in Rome or to Rome. And Luke wrote in southern Italy or somewhere out where Paul was traveling. Let's just say Asia Minor. Okay, the key here is none of these places are in the land. Not in the land. Well, that's fine. The events happened in the land, but the books were actually written down somewhere else. The apostles traveled to Antioch, to Rome, to Asia Minor, right? And Bauckham did a study of names, geography, and botany. You all know what names are. What is geography? It's the study of the land, the lay of the land. And what is botany? The plants, exactly. So he looked at the names, and he looked at the names that are in the Gospels. And he noticed that there's a proportion of names. There's more than one Jesus. There's more than one Judas. There's more than one Joseph. There's more than one Mary, right? There's more than one James. But it seems like there's one Peter, one Bartholomew. Okay, so he looked at the proportions of names in the Gospels and compared them to other written documents that we know were written in the land and the proportion of names there. And what he discovered is that the proportion of names in the scriptures in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John matches the proportions of names of lists and other documents that we know are written in the land. And here's what he concluded. Whenever people tell a story, okay, it's easy to keep the details of the story right, but it's hard to remember names. It's hard to remember names. So for example, years from now, I will remember this class. I'll remember what we taught. I'll remember what you looked like. Some interesting events happen. I will remember that. But as I try to tell my friends, well, who was there? I might replace Gemetius with George, right? I might replace Abel with Andy. You follow me? I might replace Dagim with David. Why is that? Because those are American names. You follow me? Let me give you an example. If you had to write a story in 18th century France, set in 18th century France, what would be the name of some of your main characters? What is it? Napoleon. Okay, Napoleon. Good. Anybody else? What? Louis. Okay, so we got a Louis, and a Napoleon. Anything else? You want to have a Natty in there? Or an Isaias? Do you understand what I'm getting at here? You don't know any French names, except for those two famous ones. And so if you had to make up names, you would make up Ethiopian names. And if I go home and tell people about this class years from now, and I can't remember your names, I will make up American names. This is actually very common. We see this in storytelling all over the world, where a story can move from one culture to another, and the basic, beginning, middle, and end of the narrative stay the same. Think of the Greek gods and their myths turned into Roman gods. The story stayed the same, but the names changed, right? So this happens all the time because names are more difficult to remember than events. And so while the events remain the same, the names change. However, what we see here in the Gospels is that the names what? Did not change. They retained this is called verisimilitude. Verisimilitude. It's a great word. Verisimilitude is when you tell a story and it feels authentic. It feels like those names are real names. Those events could really happen, right? So the Gospels have a high degree of verisimilitude because even though they were written in other places, the names retained the names of the land. Does that make sense? Geography is even more difficult. If you were to tell a story about 18th century France, you'd have your Napoleon and your Louis, but would you know, like, when they travel north, does it get more mountainous? Or are there rivers in the way? You follow me? Are there valleys they have to go through, or things they have to go, towns they have to go around? Do you know anything like that? No, you don't. So if you're making a story up about 18th century France, you would just have to make up the geography. However, when we read in the Gospels where the Jordan is, where the elevated sections are, where other bodies of water are, they're all exactly right. Thirdly, this one's the most difficult. Botany. What kind of trees and plants and flowers would you have in your story? You'd have no idea, right? Well, here's what's interesting. In the Gospel of Luke, Luke 19, yes. Luke 19, Jesus goes to a particular town, Jericho, And Zacchaeus sees him there. And what kind of tree does Zacchaeus climb up into? Sycamore tree, yeah. Sycamore trees only grow in Jericho and eastward towards the Jordan. Right? So there's a particular detail that the gospel writer could totally get wrong and put the wrong kind of tree in Jericho. But wouldn't you know it? Got it right. Moreover, there are times when Jesus is coming home from the Passover and there's green grass on the ground. Green grass, it's an arid country. It's a desert country. Well, after the rainy season, there's green grass, which only happens when? Right during the time of Passover. Does this make sense? So what Bauckham concludes is that whoever wrote these stories down had a high degree of knowledge of the land, the people, the geography, and even the plants and vegetation and the seasons of the land. And so he concludes that if an eyewitness were to leave Jerusalem, were to leave Galilee, and share the stories with other people in Antioch, Rome, and Asia Minor, and those people retold the story, remember the Bart Ehrman hypothesis, over and over again, and it got changed over and over again, the things that you would lose are those tiny details that don't sound like home to you. You would replace them with names, geography, and botany around Antioch. You would replace them with names, geography, and botany around Rome. You would replace them with names, geography, and botany around Asia Minor, because that's just the way we know storytelling works. However, because these texts do retain all three of these, it tells us more likely what happened was there was somebody who was in the land, saw these events, traveled to Antioch, a person traveled to Rome, a person traveled to Asia Minor, and then they wrote it down. And this is why his book is called what? Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. There are other arguments that we could make, but for the sake of time, we're going to wrap it there. And I'm going to conclude that based on the early church testimony, internal evidence like the things we've seen here in the various details that are in Matthew, ways to explain things like Matthew 22 in the language of Jeremiah's prophetic language, the work of contemporary scholars like Richard Bauckham, that the Gospel of Matthew was written before the destruction of the temple by an eyewitness. Who was that eyewitness? I think intellectual honesty has to make us say, well, I don't really know. But the church has always affirmed that Matthew is the eyewitness. The title, according to Matthew, kata Matthaion, has always been attached to this book. Has always been attached to this book. There's not a single discovery of a text of Matthew that doesn't have his name on it. So the question becomes, if it wasn't Matthew and it was some other eyewitness, why ascribe it to Matthew? Matthew is also an eyewitness. So you don't need to change it from this other eyewitness to Matthew to gain any credibility. Therefore, it's highly probable, and I think therefore affirming the testimony of the early church, that Matthew the Apostle wrote the Gospel of Matthew before 70 AD. I would add this one final point. If it wasn't written by Matthew, and it was written by somebody else, and the name according to Matthew was put on it, why would you put according to Matthew on it? If you're not an apostle and you wrote it, you would slap an apostle's name on there to give it authority, right? But why Matthew? Matthew isn't the best option. What do we even know about Matthew? He was a tax collector, and that's it. You know, you could just as well have picked any of the others. James and Peter, right, are actually better options because they have more street cred, don't they? When it comes to Mark and Luke, it's really risky putting their names on it because, like I said, they're not apostles. So why would you put a non-apostolic name on something if you wanted to carry apostolic authority? Unless it was really written by them and you're simply telling the truth. Therefore, I conclude that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are written by those men, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, just as Irenaeus described for us, before 70 AD. And there's internal evidence in these books that they are bearing eyewitness testimony. Indeed, unless we straight up just want to call Luke a liar, this is the way Luke himself even begins. So turn to Luke chapter 1. Luke chapter 1, verse 1. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things which have been accomplished among us. So there are many other texts. Many wrote about Jesus. What is many? I don't know. But Luke says there were many. Just as they were delivered to us, so those many texts were delivered to us, we gathered them up, by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. So Luke is saying that he has gathered documents, written accounts from eyewitnesses. Do you see that in verse 2? It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely. So he did some investigating. He looked around. He poked around. He asked questions. So he's got these texts from eyewitnesses, and then he's looking into it further. For some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. I'll pause right there. Some of that investigation, some people surmise, was interviewing Mary and Elizabeth and Zechariah and all these sort of details that the other Gospels don't have. And then he says in verse 4, that you may know the truth concerning the things which you have been informed. So it says in verse 3 that he wrote an orderly account. So Luke says he got eyewitnesses, he got testimony, he got texts, he followed all things closely and did some investigation, and he wrote an orderly account to the end, verse 4, that you may be confident that what you're holding is legitimate eyewitness, historically accurate stuff. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about authorship and date, matters of genre, matters of hermeneutics will come up organically as we go throughout the class. And you can also read about, in the packet you were given, Mark Strauss has stuff on genre and hermeneutics as well. And when it comes to canonicity, I just think it needs to be recognized that the early church was very careful that they only recognized books into the canon that were under the authority of an apostle. So either written by an apostle or under the authority of an apostle. And so it was a very hard set of criteria to get through. They didn't just say, oh, anything written about Jesus, let's just throw it into the canon. It had to be written by one of these eyewitnesses of the resurrection and handpicked by Jesus, either one of the 12 or Paul. And that's how it gets in there. Or under the authority of such, like John, Mark, and Luke. Okay? Comments, thoughts, questions on any of that? So thank you. So the Q source is this idea that if you take the material from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, a lot of the common material is sayings of Jesus. And so as the hypothesis goes, there must be another document floating around with just a bunch of sayings of Jesus. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke all used that same document. I've never really understood the value of that hypothesis. Sometimes scholars have a solution and they're in search of a question. You know what I mean? There's not a real problem there. And so we've never discovered Q. Q is purely hypothetical. Is it possible? I suppose it's possible. But if Matthew wrote first and he incorporated all these sayings from Jesus, and Luke and John used them, well, then Matthew himself is the Q source. Do you know what I mean? But the Q hypothesis also depends on Markan priority. Because what it says is that so here's how it works. If Mark wrote first, and Matthew used Mark, and then Luke used Mark independently of Matthew, right? So Matthew's over here reading Mark and doing his thing, and Luke is over there reading Mark and doing his thing, and they're not talking to each other, right? Then the question becomes, why is there material that's similar between Matthew and Luke that is not in Mark? Well, that's Q. That's Q. But What if Mark didn't write first? What if we're completely wrong about that? What if Matthew wrote first, and then Mark and Luke used Matthew? Then you would have to hypothesize a different Q source for the shared material between Mark and Luke. But what if they all had a copy of each other all the time? You follow me? I think these things were circulated. They were shared with other Christians. Oh, you have a story of Jesus, a biography of Jesus. Let me read it. Send this on to the other town, right? And then Matthew says, oh, I'm writing one too. And they compare notes. We know that Matthew was in Antioch and Paul traveled through Antioch. You don't think they talk to each other? I'm writing a story. I'm writing the biography of Jesus. Luke says, well, that's a great idea. Maybe I'll do one too. Or, something like that. And Peter made his rounds for sure. Also out of Antioch. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if the relationship between these texts is far more dynamic and complex than simply one wrote and another borrowed, one wrote and another borrowed. My view of inspiration is not such that the Spirit overtakes somebody and the first thing they write down. Matthew very well could have written his gospel and equally under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit went back and edited it, changed some things because good editing, writing straight from your mind is very hard, but seeing what you've written and going back and fixing it is way easier. Why do we think Matthew wouldn't have done that? It's a very organic process, just like control, like a mindless puppet control inspiration. Does that answer your question? You want to follow up on that? Okay. Other questions about authors, dates, and composition? When people, like The Chosen, is that what someone said? Yeah, where did I typically... These sort of adaptations don't sit well with me. So I'm not going to say it's wrong, because that's what storytelling is. Storytelling is taking the story and retelling it, right? When you preach, you're retelling it. You know what I mean? When you tell gospel stories to children or to unbelievers on the street, you're retelling it. You know what I mean? So my understanding is that when people take one story and tell it somewhere, they change it a little bit because it has to suit the sermon. It has to suit the street evangelism. It has to suit the movie. And so they have to make little adaptations. I think if we're smart, we realize, okay, you're making an adaptation there. I see that. I don't think The Chosen is inspired scripture. Or I don't think the Noah movie is exactly the way it happened in the Bible. Did you all see the Noah movie? There was a movie called Noah with, what? No, that was the Exodus. I never saw that one. With the gladiator guy. What? Russell Crowe. Russell Crowe, yeah. So he did a retake of Noah. And it was they had changed it, right? And so I just say to myself, okay, you had to change things because movies are different than ancient Near Eastern texts, right? And so I recognize that that's just going to happen. So people who don't like that, I would simply say to them, fine, don't go watch the movie, don't watch the show and just read the scriptures. You'll be better off. You'll get a more accurate picture, and you won't be influenced by the interpretation of the editor and the producer and the director and the actors and so forth. That's fine. So I don't really go for them. I don't watch them, but I also don't come down so hard on people when they do that, right? I mean, for the longest time, I mean, you know this, here in this country, there weren't texts that could commonly be just purchased either on your laptop, on your phone, or in a written hard copy like you got right there. So people used icons. They painted icons on the church walls for telling the stories of Adam and Eve and Noah and Jesus and so forth. Right, now there are theological issues there. When you're starting to have an image of God, that breaks the commandment, right? So yeah, that's my short answer. I don't love them, but I can't say they're necessarily wrong. If we recognize what we're doing, we're telling a story in a different genre, and that genre means interpretation, And so just be aware that you're being influenced by the interpretation of others. So if you're aware of that, okay, you can kind of hold it at bay. It's a good question. He made the disciples get into the boat. Why not say he made us get into the boat, right? That's just an author's prerogative. An author decides what voice and what person they're going to write in, right? And Matthew decided to sort of take himself out of it a little bit and be a little more objective. I don't think that negates the firsthand storytelling of it. But I don't know why. Probably because when you start to use us and me language, then it puts you in the story a little too much. And maybe Matthew would say, look, this is about Jesus, and so I'm going to extract myself as much as possible. And one way to do that is to speak in the third person. He told the disciples to get into the boat. He told them to get into the boat. Right?
That's what John often does.
John does it too. Yeah, John does it too. Yeah. This is a good question. Gemetius. Yeah, so that's part of the Mark and priority hypothesis. Because he has a low Christology, Matthew bumps it up one, right? I don't think that's true. We'll see in Mark later today that Mark has a very high Christology. I think you're not reading carefully enough if you don't think he has a high Christology. I mean, just in the very beginning, I'll just give you one example now. John the Baptist says, prepare the way of the road for the Lord. And then Jesus comes walking along the road. Prepare the way for the Lord. Here comes Jesus on the way. So pretty connect the dots there, right? Jesus is the Lord apparent in history. So that's pretty high Christology, right? It's a good question. I think what people confuse, though, is they see in Mark Jesus is suffering a little more, right? And so he has very high humanity. And they equate that with a low Christology. But no, that Jesus is God as a man is a high Christology. A full understanding of his humanity is also has a high Christology, high view of Jesus as divine. Yeah, we'll see that later today.